Hey, I'm Nicole, and I have an absolutely embarrassing story to tell you. It all started with a prank that turned out to be worse than we immediately thought. Well, it all started when a new chemistry teacher came to our school. Let's call him Mr. Jackson. He was younger than most of our teachers, and at first, we thought it would be awesome. But we soon found out that we were completely mistaken. He was very strict. Like, our previous teacher would give us good grades without us even having to do a lot of work. But Mr. Jackson insisted that we work hard and would punish us if we didn't. Me and my friend Vanessa were kind of mad at him because he was ruining our grades. So we decided to get revenge. A lot of people would make fun of Mr. Jackson because he was, a little clumsy. Like, he would talk really quietly and often forget things. You could say he was weird, but we didn't like him because he was giving us a hard time. We thought hard about what kind of prank we could pull off, and we decided to fill his chair with glue. And we did it while everyone else was in the cafeteria. The lesson started, and we were waiting for Mr. Jackson to show up. We were so excited. He came in, looking into his books as usual, quietly saying hello to everyone, and then he sat down. Both me and Vanessa were trying really hard not to laugh. At first, he was sitting, talking about that day's topic for class for like 5 minutes. And then he stood up to write something on the blackboard, and he couldn't. He got really confused and looked at everyone, lost and even a little scared. He did it again, and this time he stood up, together with his chair. At this point, we couldn't hold our laughter any longer, but everyone else was laughing too. After a few steps, Mr. Jackson sat down and desperately tried to separate himself from the chair, but he couldn't do it. He was so ashamed of himself and quietly said, "Help." One or two of my classmates stood up, took him by the hands, and started pulling, trying to unglue him from the chair. Finally, after a few pulls, they did it. Only a small piece of his pants actually stayed stuck to the chair. Everyone, including Vanessa, was still laughing. But I was getting uncomfortable because I didn't think about how far this would go. Well, Mr. Jackson got so embarrassed that he raised his voice and said that he will find out who did it, and then he left the classroom. Vanessa was so happy about it. Me, not so much. Pretty soon, everyone in school knew the story, and everyone was making fun of Mr. Jackson. And he was the kind of person who just couldn't stand up for himself. I was so ashamed of my actions, but it got worse. You see, when my parents saw my chemistry grades, they decided to hire a tutor for me. And it turns out that they talked with Mr. Jackson, and he agreed to do it. He needed it because after what happened, he asked to leave for a few weeks, and this was something he could do during that time. He had no idea that it was me who did it. In fact, when he started to give me private tutoring lessons, I saw him for what he really was, a really passionate teacher. During the breaks in our studies, he would tell me that he was actually that strict because he wanted us to learn, and he really tried to make every lesson as exciting as he possibly could. He also said to me that he always thought that I was really smart, and that was the reason he was giving me such a hard time. He even told me that he was working on a lesson that would tell us how he could have dealt with the glue incident using chemistry. I suddenly remembered all his lessons and realized that they were really interesting, and he was teaching us a lot of useful information, but I wasn't listening because I was too busy chatting with Vanessa. I felt guilty, but I still couldn't confess to him. After a while, he returned to school, but everyone kept making fun of him. He continued to be my tutor, though. One day, at the start of our lesson, he said, "We need to talk." It turns out that someone told him that it was me who had something to do with the glue prank. I immediately started to make excuses, but he said, "You can either confess or I will tell your parents about this." I continued to lie. So he stood up and went straight to my parents. They were shocked and really angry at me. And my dad raised his voice at me, which he had never done before. Of course, Mr. Jackson refused to tutor me after that, and I was grounded. I felt so ashamed of everything, so I promised myself that I would study really hard to prove that I had changed. I studied super hard, and he noticed. And despite the fact that he was angry at me, he was still very fair with grades and stuff. By this time, a lot of the other students had noticed that he was a good teacher, but some of them still made fun of him and disrespected him. One of them was Vanessa. I tried to explain to her that he was a good guy and that she should stop, but she really had it out for him and didn't want to hear anything I had to say, especially because nobody had grounded her, and nobody had told the teacher about her either, so she was safe. She frequently argued with him, and she was still getting bad grades, so she decided to do the worst thing possible. She wanted to do the same prank again. I caught her doing it and asked her to please stop, but she wouldn't listen. So I had to do the only thing I could. I decided to warn Mr. Jackson. Class started and I saw him enter the classroom. I tried to warn him, but he didn't want to listen. He just said, "Nicole, go back to your seat," and continued on his path. I wanted to save him, so I did something pretty stupid. I sat on the chair myself. Looking back at it, I could have done a lot of other things, but I panicked, so I sat on the chair. And Mr. Jackson asked, "What are you doing?" But then he slowly realized what had actually happened. He immediately dismissed the entire class to spare me from the embarrassment, and Vanessa gave me a very nasty look on the way out. Mr. Jackson helped get me off the chair and took me to the principal. He told her everything, and the principal asked me why I would do this a second time. I said that I had nothing to do with it this time, and she asked me to tell her who it was. I told her that I didn't want to tell. But the principal said that it wasn't worth protecting this person because what they did wasn't nice to Mr. Jackson or even to me. I finally told them who did it and told them the whole story. Both me and Vanessa got put into detention where we had to study a lot. I also got into a lot of trouble at home. Vanessa hated me for what I'd done and she stopped being friends with me. One day, Mr. Jackson told me that he was proud of me doing the right thing and that he noticed how hard I had worked. And I finally told him I was sorry. Sadly, he left our school after the end of that school year. It was really hard for him to recover after everything that happened to him. This is probably the worst thing I've ever done to a person. I feel really ashamed. Now remembering Mr. Jackson helps me to continue studying, and I really do hope that students treat him better at another school. Please share this story so kids will remember that teachers are also people, even if we don't like them sometimes.